This is just a sample of the audiobook. To get the complete audiobook, access the link posted in the first comment.
Spirits were distilled in America long before the birth of the whiskey industry. Rum and gin were produced in cities along the eastern seaboard by colonists who had brought their stills with them to the New World. Whiskey came into widespread favor only with the end of the Revolutionary War and the beginning of the westward expansion, when the costs of transporting the ingredients over the mountains made rum and gin too expensive to produce. Whiskey could, however, be made from readily available local produce, and it became one of the most common of the home-produced spirits. In the early years of the westward expansion, stills were still manufactured in the east, and settlers had to bring them west with them. But demand soon grew large enough that coppersmiths began to manufacture them in western Pennsylvania and Kentucky. The American pot still differed little from the European still, which had been in use for centuries. It was simply a large copper pot made to be fitted with a separate head and gooseneck that could be attached to the copper worm, a coil of copper tubing immersed in a barrel of water. The fermented mash, or distiller's beer, which was made from grain, was poured into the pot, and the head was positioned on top of the pot and sealed to prevent the vapors from leaking through the joint. The beer was heated over an open fire, allowing the alcohol to vaporize and pass through the worm, where the water cooled the vapors, which became liquid again, allowing the alcohol to be collected and stored in a cistern. The whiskey could then be refined and made more palatable by distilling it a second time, in either the same still or a second still called a doubler, refining the quality of the spirit by taking out unpleasant flavors. The end result was clear, unflavored liquid alcohol. Color and taste came from the fruit, sugar, or herbs added after distillation. Because the stills most of these farmers possessed needed to be easy to transport, they were rarely over 150 gallons in capacity. Their output was therefore limited, never more than 1,000 gallons a year and sometimes less than 100. The still described by Henry Clay in an undated copy of a court document filed in Kentucky's Fayette County Court on behalf of his cousin Green Clay. Green Clay had in October 1800 purchased a still from George Coons and John Cock that had never been delivered, is typical. It is described as follows: one still to hold 115 gallons exclusive of the cap, and has a cap and worm with the still. This is an average size for a still. It is large enough that beer from 2 50-gallon fermenting tubs can be distilled in it. Clay goes on to indicate that the still should be of good thick copper, such as was common for a still of that size, and to be finished off in a good workmanlike manner, with lead where the arm joins the cap and the spout. Such construction would guarantee many years of use. Farmers in the newly opened territories looked at distilled alcohol the same way they looked at salted pork and smoked hams, as just another product to sell, whether in jugs or barrels, for cash or barter, for needed goods and services. A farm-based distillery was usually a small-time operation, typically 1 or 2 stills, with a capacity of about 100 gallons each. The beer a farmer distilled was made from grain he raised. Farmers who did not own stills often used a neighbor's, paying for use with a portion of the whiskey produced. Millers, too, distilled whiskey. Because they kept a portion of the grain they milled as payment, they always had a surplus on hand that could be turned to profit. And many millers turned this surplus grain into whiskey, which was more valuable than grain because it was easier to transport. Early distillers made their whiskey from whatever grain they had on hand, usually corn or rye, but also occasionally wheat. An example of an early recipe for mash bill, the ingredients from which the fermented mash is distilled, is the Pennington method.